Have you ever been ignored by someone you love and felt like the silence hurt more than any insult ever could? No yelling, no arguments, no explanation, just complete emotional distance. At first, you wonder if they're simply busy. Then hours turn into days. You replay every conversation in your mind, searching for something you might have done wrong. You send another message. No reply. You apologize, even when you're not sure what you're apologizing for, and little by little, something strange begins to happen. You stop questioning their behavior and start questioning yourself. That's exactly where they want you. Because for a narcissist, silence isn't peace. It isn't emotional regulation. It isn't taking healthy space. It's a weapon. One of the most powerful weapons they have, and the terrifying part is that most victims don't even realize they're under psychological attack until the damage has already been done. Today, you're going to discover why narcissists rely on the silent treatment, what it secretly does to your brain, and most importantly, how you can stop becoming a prisoner of someone else's silence. Most people believe abuse has to be loud to be dangerous. They imagine screaming matches, insults, threats, or physical violence. But psychology tells us something very different. Emotional neglect activates many of the same regions in the brain as physical pain. Think about that for a second. Being deliberately ignored can literally hurt. Humans are wired for connection. Since the beginning of civilization, being rejected by the group often meant death. Our brains never completely abandon that survival mechanism. So when someone suddenly withdraws affection, communication, and emotional presence without explanation, your nervous system doesn't interpret it as a simple disagreement. It interprets it as danger. That's why your heart races. That's why your thoughts become obsessive. That's why you feel an overwhelming urge to fix the relationship immediately. The narcissist understands this instinct, whether consciously or unconsciously, and uses it to gain control over your emotions. The silent treatment rarely appears out of nowhere. It usually begins after something incredibly small. Maybe you disagreed with them. Maybe you questioned one of their stories. Maybe you set a healthy boundary. Or maybe you simply failed to give them the admiration they expected. To a psychologically healthy person, these moments are normal parts of any relationship. But to a narcissist, they represent something much bigger. They experience disagreement as disrespect. Boundaries feel like rejection. Accountability feels like humiliation. Instead of communicating openly, they disappear emotionally. They stop answering messages. They avoid eye contact. They become cold, distant, unreachable. Suddenly you're standing outside an invisible wall that wasn't there yesterday, desperately trying to understand what happened. And because they refuse to explain, your imagination fills in the blanks, usually with self-blame. This is where the real manipulation begins. Silence creates uncertainty. Uncertainty creates anxiety. Anxiety creates compliance. Once your emotional balance is shaken, you're far more likely to surrender your own needs, just to make the discomfort stop. You apologize more quickly. You stop bringing up concerns. You become careful with every word you say. Slowly, the relationship transforms into a game where only one person controls the rules. They don't need to shout. They don't need to threaten you. Your fear of being ignored again becomes enough to keep you obedient. That's the frightening efficiency of psychological manipulation. The victim starts policing themselves before the narcissist even has to act. Think about how casinos work. Slot machines don't reward every pull. If they did, people would lose interest. Instead, rewards come unpredictably. Sometimes you win, most of the time you lose. That uncertainty keeps people addicted because the brain keeps chasing the next reward. Narcissistic relationships often function the same way. One day they're affectionate, charming, and deeply connected. The next day they vanish emotionally without warning. Then suddenly they're warm again, acting as if nothing happened. This unpredictable cycle creates what's known as intermittent reinforcement, one of the strongest psychological conditioning methods ever studied. You don't become attached because they're consistently loving. You become attached because you're constantly chasing the return of the loving version they occasionally show you. And every episode of silent treatment makes that emotional addiction even stronger. The most dangerous part is that victims often confuse relief with love. After days of emotional isolation, the narcissist suddenly sends a simple text. Maybe it's just hey. Maybe they smile again. Maybe they touch your hand. Instantly your body floods with relief. Your anxiety disappears. You feel grateful that the nightmare is over. But notice what happened. Nothing was actually resolved. There was no conversation, no accountability, no apology. Your brain simply became addicted to the removal of emotional pain. It's the same principle behind many forms of psychological dependence. The absence of suffering starts feeling like affection, and that's exactly how control becomes invisible. Over time, something even more destructive begins to develop. You stop trusting your own perception. Every conflict leaves you wondering whether you're actually the problem. Friends tell you their behavior seems unhealthy, but you defend them anyway. You remember the good moments. You convince yourself they're just stressed. Maybe they're overwhelmed. Maybe they're having a difficult week. Maybe you really did overreact. The narcissist rarely has to convince you anymore because you've learned to do it yourself. This process slowly erodes self-confidence until your own judgment feels less trustworthy than their silence. That's one of the greatest victories psychological manipulators can achieve. They no longer need to control your reality because you've started rewriting it on their behalf. Little by little, your entire emotional world begins to revolve around one question: what can I do to make them talk to me again? Notice how dangerous that question is. It shifts your focus away from their behavior and places all the responsibility on your shoulders. Instead of asking whether they are treating you with respect, you're asking how you can earn basic human decency. That shift changes everything. You stop evaluating the relationship. You start performing for it. Every conversation becomes carefully calculated. Every opinion gets filtered. Every disagreement feels risky. You laugh when you don't find something funny. You agree when you actually disagree. You sacrifice small pieces of yourself day after day, believing that if you become good enough, the silence will finally stop. But it never does, because the goal was never to solve a conflict. The goal was to teach you that your emotional security depends entirely on their approval. This is why so many survivors say they felt like they were walking on eggshells. It's an exhausting way to live. Imagine waking up every morning wondering which version of the other person you'll meet. Will they be affectionate, cold, dismissive, completely absent? Your nervous system never gets a chance to relax because it's constantly scanning for emotional danger. Psychologists call this hypervigilance. It's a state where your brain remains on high alert, looking for signs of rejection before they even happen. Over time, this constant stress affects your sleep, your concentration, your confidence, and even your physical health. You may develop headaches, digestive problems, muscle tension, or chronic fatigue without realizing that the source isn't your body, it's the relationship. One of the biggest misconceptions about narcissistic behavior is that the silent treatment is simply emotional immaturity. Sometimes emotionally immature people do withdraw because they feel overwhelmed, but healthy people eventually return to the conversation. They explain themselves, they take responsibility for their emotions, they work toward repair. A narcissist often does the opposite. The silence is intentional because it creates an imbalance of power. While you're desperately searching for answers, they're watching you chase them. Every unanswered message becomes proof that they still control your emotional state. Every apology you send reinforces their position. They learn that they don't need honesty or empathy to influence you. They only need your fear of abandonment. Have you ever noticed how quickly your priorities change during the silent treatment? Yesterday, you wanted respect, honesty, and communication. Today, you'd settle for a single text message. That's not an accident. It's psychological conditioning. When someone repeatedly deprives you of emotional connection, your standards begin to shrink. You stop expecting a healthy relationship and start celebrating tiny signs of attention. A simple good morning suddenly feels like a major victory. A short conversation feels like proof that things are getting better. But in reality, your expectations have been lowered so dramatically that you're rewarding behavior that should have been normal from the beginning. This creates a cycle that becomes incredibly difficult to escape. The narcissist distances themselves, you panic, you chase, they return, you feel relieved, then everything repeats. Every cycle strengthens the emotional bond while weakening your independence. Ironically, the more pain they cause, the more emotionally invested you often become. Outsiders struggle to understand this. They ask, "Why don't you just leave?" But trauma doesn't work that way. The human brain forms powerful attachments under conditions of unpredictable reward and emotional stress. That's why intelligent, capable, confident people can remain trapped for years. It isn't a lack of intelligence, it's the result of powerful psychological conditioning that slowly reshapes the way you think, feel, and react. Another reason the silent treatment is so effective is because it steals closure. Human beings naturally seek explanations. We want stories to have endings. We want conflicts to make sense. When someone refuses to communicate, your mind keeps searching for answers that never come. You replay conversations from weeks ago. You analyze facial expressions. You reread old text messages. You invent possible explanations. The unanswered questions become mental loops that consume enormous amounts of emotional energy. Meanwhile, the narcissist doesn't have to say a single word. Your own imagination does the work for them. The silence becomes louder than any argument ever could. What's even more disturbing is that many narcissists return as though nothing happened. There is no apology, no acknowledgement of the emotional damage they caused. They simply begin talking again, expecting you to do the same. And because you've been craving connection for so long, you're tempted to accept it. You tell yourself it's better than fighting. You don't want to ruin the moment. So you bury your feelings once again. But every time you ignore your own pain to preserve the relationship, you send yourself a dangerous message. My emotions matter less than keeping this person happy. Over months or years, that belief quietly becomes part of your identity. Eventually, many victims no longer recognize themselves. The confident person who once spoke openly now hesitates before expressing an opinion. The independent person who once trusted their instincts now constantly seeks reassurance. The joyful person who once laughed easily now feels emotionally exhausted. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. It happens through hundreds of small moments where fear replaces authenticity. That's why emotional abuse is often invisible from the outside. Friends see the same face, but internally, an entirely different person has been created. One shaped by uncertainty, self-doubt, and the constant need to avoid another episode of silence. Here's the truth that changes everything. The silent treatment only works because it hijacks one of the deepest human needs: connection. There is nothing weak about wanting love, understanding, or communication. Those needs are completely normal. The problem begins when someone deliberately weaponizes those needs against you. The moment you understand that, the silence starts losing its power. Because you stop interpreting it as evidence that you're unworthy. You begin seeing it for what it really is, a strategy designed to keep you emotionally dependent. And once you recognize the strategy, you're no longer playing the game without knowing the rules.